Have you ever pitched a brilliant product idea only to watch it disappear into the corporate abyss? When I teach product managers about the 7 elements of product mastery, their eyes often glaze over when we reach portfolio management, and they'll say, that's someone else's job, usually referring to senior leaders. But here's the wake-up call that really changes their perspective. First, you'll never successfully champion your ideas if you don't understand how they fit into the larger portfolio puzzle. And second, for career-minded individuals, how are you going to reach those senior leader levels that are doing portfolio management if you don't understand it yourself? You need to understand how to construct and manage portfolios. Those are 2 good reasons to learn more about portfolio management, which is why Colin Nelson is joining us. Colin is the Chief Innovation Consultant at Hype Innovation, a leading provider of innovation management software and consulting services. He is an expert in the field of collective intelligence, supporting global organizations and communities on how to achieve efficient, effective, and sustainable innovation and business change using online tools and processes. Colin is a respected thought leader on several innovation subjects, including innovation management, enterprise collaboration, and innovation portfolio management, publishing articles on each of these. So whether you're trying to get your product ideas noticed, or perhaps plotting that path to a senior leadership role, today's conversation will equip you with the portfolio management knowledge you need to succeed. Also, if you're listening to us and you would rather watch the video version of our discussion, simply go to our YouTube channel, search for Product Mastery Now on YouTube. Let's jump in and learn more about product innovation portfolio management right after this.
How can you unlock your full potential as a product manager? We're sharing the product management insights you need. They are based on the 7 research-backed knowledge areas for product mastery. You'll learn to create products customers love, enhance your influence, and elevate your career. Welcome to Product Mastery Now, hosted by Dr. Chad McAllister, product management professor, practitioner, and your guide.
Colin, thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Good to be with you, Chad.
I've been following your writing some. Delighted that we could meet in way of this podcast. First, just want to get a little more background as that Chief Innovation Consultant at Hype Innovation. What kind of projects do you get involved with?
Yeah, so a really wide variety, as you might imagine, because innovation, of course, is a broad church. I'm a former corporate innovator myself, so I used to do the very traditional innovation job of understanding unmet needs, emerging needs from organizations, developing capabilities, and then working with partners to refine those before testing and validating them and then rolling them back into the business. And that was my background. But for the last 15, 20 years or so, I've been working with typically medium to large corporates on how they can improve innovation performance. And there are 4 big themes that come up through that process, many different components, of course, but 4 big themes. The first one is absorbing external signals. How do I listen better to what things that are happening outside of my organization, new technologies, trends, regulations, competitor insights, use those to help set strategy and feed into leadership? How do I involve my employees in the process of innovation to make a culture of innovation possible where sharing and collaboration is more the natural DNA of a business? Innovating across the value chain is a very popular area at the moment. So how do we get our supply chain, our customers, our academic partners involved? And then finally, and perhaps the topic for today, is exploiting our innovation portfolio and doing effective innovation portfolio management within what often are quite complex, highly distributed, highly devolved responsibilities within medium to large enterprises. So right across that full spectrum, it's a really diverse range of work. And it's also diverse in terms of the industries. So I've worked with every sector pretty much, from aerospace to NGOs, from sports organizations to law firms. What they've all got in common is they're trying to do innovation better. They're coming at it from different levels of maturity, different starting points, but everybody's trying to do better than what they do today.
Yep, very good. I'm glad you shared those 4 areas. They certainly resonate with me. Also suggest we might get back together and talk a little bit more about some of these other areas in the future. But for this discussion, let's focus in on that innovation portfolio management. I just want to kind of open it up, and this might be the heart of our conversation. What do you see as the objectives of portfolio management when it comes to helping an organization innovate better, right?
Well, really, it's the execution piece in between, is actually having something done and starting it, of course. It's that journey of development. And we have to go back to the fundamentals of why do we innovate at all? Why do we develop new things? And really, it's about protecting the future of our organization and
Right.
ensuring that we stay relevant. And that in a world now where change and disruptions are regular, almost constant, to choose what we're working on, what intensity to work on that new thing, can be the difference between thriving and surviving. Creating that connection between the people that are doing the work of innovation, the concept development, and the strategy and the leadership teams to ensure that we are heading in the direction that the business wants us to head in increases the chances, of course, that new things get implemented, but it also increases the chances that leadership get what they want, which at the end of the day, in most commercial organizations, is profit and revenue. So that portfolio management objective is to try and make that process of development, I think, as efficient as we possibly can, whilst also offering that window on the work that we're doing so that good decisions can be made. Now, I think that portfolio management is even more important than ever has been in the past, simply because of the pace of change. With it being political change or commercial change or business disruptions, we're also seeing new technologies emerging faster than ever. If we marry that to the fact that innovation takes time, it's really important that we have that transparency over the things that we're working on so that we can pivot and change direction as and when change occurs. But if we don't have good portfolio management, we don't really know what everybody's working on. How on earth can we pivot and adapt? And again, that can be the difference between thriving and surviving in today's world.
Yep. Yep. Okay. Really good foundation about the importance of this. I often think about portfolio management in the context of strategy and how, as product people, product managers, product innovators, can we actually know what to develop if we don't have a good handle on the organization's strategy and
Mm,
expect to see an alignment there some. Can you talk about that aspect of, I see
mm.
it as the starting place when we think about any kind of project to take on. Is it a fit or not? How do you think about it in terms of portfolio management?
Yeah, so I think that organizations' innovation strategies are becoming increasingly important, and perhaps they have been less so in certain industries in the past, is where is it we want to take our businesses? And the answer to that often lies in foresighting, in insight gathering, in sitting down and looking at different opportunities and deciding where are the focus areas or the hunting grounds that we're prepared to go and play. Where do we think we can leverage our core competencies and assets and actually be successful in the future, not just necessarily today, but also tomorrow? And in many ways, innovation is sales. It's just tomorrow's sales. It's further down the path. But that strategy, I have this strategy element should really dictate the zones in which we are going to develop and hunt. I have this sort of feeling that always most back end development problems start off as front end problems. Have we generated an idea or a concept that isn't really aligned to where we want to go? Have we generated something that is contradictory to something that we're already trying to do? Unless we have good portfolio management, we don't get to see these things. So the strategy really should be the starting point. And that's why I emphasized those four zones earlier, which is the starting point is listening. It's about absorbing external signals. It's about foresighting. It's about thinking about our core competencies and assets, and then setting a series of possible direction points within which we can then innovate. If you go back to the old dusty suggestion box that perhaps we all remember on the manufacturing line, it'd be quite common to ask your employees to share an idea on how something could be better. If you look at implementation rates for those things, they're really low, less than 1% in many cases, if not worse. And one of the reasons is not necessarily because of the quality of what's shared. It might be a fantastic idea to make something better, but it might not be
Mhm.
aligned with where leadership is prepared to make a change, where they're prepared to put their money and their resources. And if that alignment is not there, that idea is not going to be implemented. Now, that might only be a basic idea on a manufacturing line, but you can magnify that and amplify that up to enterprise level. Unless where we innovate and we make changes is aligned to where the organization is prepared to commit resources and time, things are not going to happen.
Yep. Yeah. So that suggests that we have strong strategic objectives from senior leaders guiding the organization. And that's somehow then communicated to the rest of the employees, if indeed we do have a more modern version of the suggestion box. What are you seeing? I like this path you're weaving between an innovation topic with foresighting and understanding the changing business environment and strategy, which is typically I think often thought about as a not an innovation type of activity. How do you see that playing together? How do you see the organization coming up with those strategic objectives with a foresighting twist?
Yeah, it's a great point. To me, the strategy is the hierarchy, the plan of all the areas that we are going to go and focus on and explore. I think that if I look at the best of the best organizations, who's actually good at this, what they're typically doing is they're trying to do a little bit of both listening to what's happening right now, as well as projecting where things could potentially be. They're looking at the emerging trends, they're looking at the emerging technologies, but they're marrying that with what they have in very clear focus is what are my good core competencies and assets. If I don't know what my assets and competencies are, it's very difficult to know how I might leverage those to attack any particular direction of travel. So it's really an iterative process. So if we think about what's happening out there, what signals am I absorbing? What are the macro trends that are likely to impact my business, my environment, my country? Where that might generate opportunities has to be married to that question of core competency and assets. Then you have to continually ask yourself that question. And what I mean by this is what you're good at is not necessarily the same as what you sell.
Hmm.
If you think about an organization like McDonald's are the most successful burger chain in the world. Yet if I asked 20 people in the street, could you make a better burger than McDonald's? Most people would say that they could. Well, how's that possible? How can anybody make a better product not be the successful not successful as McDonald's, right? It's because McDonald's are good, amazing at other things, phenomenal at real estate management, they're incredible at marketing, at logistics, at consistency. What they're good at is different to what they sell. And I think the starting point for organizations should be to think about what am I good at? And it might not be what I sell. And marrying those insights around assets and competencies to the external influences that then sets us some areas to explore. Because often the answer is a cluster of things. Let me give you a nice example. I was working with an automotive company, a company that made alloy and steel wheels. The most commodity you can imagine, right? What can you do with a wheel? The designs were dictated to them by the car manufacturers. Really, they had what I would consider one innovation dimension. That's weight. What can you, and that's really heavily affected by material. So you can put more magnesium in a wheel, makes it lighter, or you can put less in, makes it heavier. And they wanted to try and break out of this cycle. So they decided to start thinking about what are we really good at? What do we sell? What insights are we hearing? And I'll give you some insights to that. They would see that more people wanted larger wheels than they used to, more aesthetically pleasing, and from a design perspective, it looks a little nicer. But there's a consequence of that, which meant skinnier tire walls. Then they started to think, well, what's the consumer experience of this? And what they discovered when you married the fact that most of us have worse road conditions than we used to, that
Right.
combination of bigger wheels, skinnier tire walls, worsening road conditions, heavily linked to either climate change or reducing funding in municipalities, that led to more blowouts. So the consumer, the person at the end of their value chain, was having a worse experience. So they started to think about, well, could we create a wheel with a flexible rim that worked in harmony with the sidewall of the tire, which would help eliminate that? Do we know anything about flexible rims? No, we don't. That's not our core competency. We're a fantastic manufacturing company. We're brilliant at metals. So they went to Michelin, which at the time were the leaders in flexible wheels, and said, can we work together? And they created a wheel with a flexible rim that works in harmony with the sidewall of a tire that would help eliminate this issue of blowouts with larger wheels. But their starting point was, what are we good at? What can we potentially apply that to? And then what insights are we generating? That created a series of opportunities, one of which was this flexible wheel rim thing, which was there what they then pushed forward. So hopefully what you
Hmm.
can see there is this alignment between a bit of foresighting, a bit of insight gathering, which then leads to a set of potential strategy options. And then it's about investigating those and developing those and seeing which ones were viable. And this was the one that made it. But you can begin to see what that journey looks like in terms of how these things sort of hang together, I hope.
Yeah, and I like the alignment there that was supportive of their brand recognition also, right? That one made sense. That they could have gone in another direction and probably would have been wise to set up a new brand if it was not related to wheels in some way, right?
Right.
But we've seen breakdowns like that. The classic one that no one remembers anymore because I'm getting too old. The cassette tape, right, was owned by, I'm drawing a blank on the name of the
Maxwell?
Maxwell. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'm older than I look.
And yeah. And Maxwell, they regarded their core competency as plastics. We know how to make things out of plastic. and they entered the razor market and was going to try to take over Gillette in the razor market. We don't know this story because they pulled it 6 months after they started it, right? So brand alignment is important. When we're thinking about how to structure, so we have the overall corporate strategy and then how to structure the actual portfolio and ways to do that. You've alluded to a couple of things that I want to try to pull in here. The suggestion box, which suggests itself some flexibility of the portfolio management process because we might be getting new ideas from employees as they see things going on that weren't part of the original strategic kind of perspective. And so that suggests some flexibility in the portfolio to accommodate things that maybe weren't part of the original structure, how we thought about our place in the world and the products we're creating. How do you bring that flexibility into the portfolio and managing that?
That's a great point. I think there's a general recognition that agility is crucial to innovation, and by consequence, the portfolio management part of that. Agility is critical simply because of the pace of change that we're now exposed to. Innovation takes time. In an aerospace company, you could be talking decades for a new plane to come to market. In a pharmaceutical company, a successful drug might take 13 to 15 years. Maybe in consumer goods, things move a little faster, but innovation does take time. And the world moves on while you're innovating. So having a static portfolio, which is never refined, is never iterated, is never developed and reviewed, is potentially very risky. Because if the world moves on in between you generating a new concept and delivering it to the market, you may not have a market to sell it to.
Right.
And in certain industries, that's becoming more pertinent than others. If you think about the disruption that perhaps the professional services sector is facing right now with artificial intelligence, a law firm that has never had to innovate to survive in its life suddenly needs to care about artificial intelligence and the fact that a machine can generate a contract faster than a human being. That creates a need to suddenly start thinking about what does the business model look like? What is in our portfolio? What kind of change do we want to expose ourselves to? And knowing that we're picking one of several hopefully viable paths. So agility by design is becoming important. To get back to the point of your question, well, where does that come from? Well, one of the things it dictates is that we need to have some common data. We need to know money in, money out, timeline, level of confidence we have on anything that we're working on. Even though it might be wildly different things, there needs to be some common data that can feed into some degree of common dashboard so we can actually get a holistic view of everything that we're working on. I worked for a long time with an energy company in Texas, and they implemented what they called a globally visible innovation pipeline. And it created transparency over everything new that was being worked upon, that leadership and strategists could see from the incremental things all the way through to the more strategic and disruptive things. The reason they did that was so they could avoid overlaps, so they could look for synergies, and they could also identify gaps in the work that was being done and ensure there was that continual alignment to strategy. But what it also did is it gave them the opportunity to pivot when they felt they needed to. So in parallel to that portfolio, that globally visible innovation pipeline, they also had an innovation shelf. This is the home for things that they're not currently working on, but potentially could receive investment and time in the future. These are good concepts. Maybe the technology wasn't ready when we tried it a few years ago. Maybe it's something we just don't have the capacity to do right now. Maybe the upside isn't as significant as it's going to be in 3 to 5 years' time. So it's parked, it's on the shelf. And so what they would then do is every 6 months they would look at that portfolio and make a judgment in terms of, is everything that we're working on the best possible use of our capacity? Or do we need to pivot, maybe take something off the shelf and replace something that we're working on today? So agility by design. So as an innovator, as somebody who was working on the concept development, it was an expectation not that you deliver everything through to implementation, but that you have a critical eye on the new thing that you're working on. And if you feel that may not be the best use of your time and capacity, actually raise your hand. If you think that this isn't going anywhere, don't keep bashing your head against a brick wall. Seek help. And if you can't solve the problem, then maybe we park it. And it's not seen as a reflection of you. It's actually seen as a smart business decision. Far too often we put something in and we just expect it to pop out the other end. And the
Right.
reality is innovation should be a funnel. And that means that some things should stop. So Innovation, agility by design, embedded into the way that we review our portfolio, requires some common data. It needs everybody feeding into at least the same categories of a concept development process, whatever they are. It requires that portfolio to be reviewed and for everybody to realize that they're part of a whole, not an individual, which I think is critical in making sure that people, as you said earlier on, can understand where they fit into this overall direction of travel.
Okay, good. So two topics there that came up for me. One, just the notion of shelving concepts, shelving ideas is really valuable, helpful. Anytime we go down the path of developing something new, we may run into information that tells us the timing is not right, the market is not going to be receptive to this. We should not force that. We should move on to something that is sounds more valuable, better resources in the right place. And we run into technology things. When I was interviewing, just as an example, interviewing a serial innovator at Caterpillar making the big digging machines. I don't know why they had gone down this path, but they created a electric actuator. That they were in the business of using these big giant hydraulic oil-filled actuators to lift the excavator bucket and do other things. And for some reason, R&D created a electric version of it, which they had no use for at the time, apparently. They put it on the shelf. And a few years later, around came a need for such a thing that couldn't be satisfied with the hydraulic system. So these are important things to have. In that comes up this issue of resources. And this is often one of the reasons we think about portfolios is to make better use of the resources we have and balance our resources appropriately over the things that we actually want to work on. Can you talk about that aspect of portfolio management?
Yeah. I think the starting point has to be that no organization has enough people or enough money
Right.
to do everything that they would like to do. We are
As I say,
always
we almost
capacity.
always have too many projects and not enough resources.
Nobody's short of ideas or new things to do, right? Exactly. So, with that in mind, it's then a question of prioritization. And that prioritization is something that is going to change over time as the market changes, as the organization changes, as pressures change. So, therefore, this goes back to this agility by design. It's about making sure we hire good people that are properly trained and then letting them work on these things that we have selected for them, but not to the point where they spend a year bashing their head against a brick wall. We need to be able to repurpose those individuals onto better options if we see there's a better path. I think that organizations have struggled with this sort of concept a little bit, which is if something fails, is it the person's fault? If you've hired good people, it probably isn't. As you said, maybe the technology isn't ready. Maybe the market's not ready. Maybe we just prefer something else right now. It's a better choice.
Mhm.
So the person involved in that process of developing something new needs to understand what game we're playing here. This is not about you pushing this to the absolute limit. Is if you don't think it's going to work, let's fail faster and reallocate you to something that you think will work. I think that also I'm seeing organizations lean on third parties more in terms of that development process. So not just the in-house expertise, but also supply chain, the organizations that maybe we're co-creating with. Increasingly, organizations are realizing that not all the smartest people work for us. And we also have to utilize the wider network, the wider ecosystem to innovate. There's more deliberate diversity, more creativity that becomes possible, but then also means that we might be saying, actually, I'm not going to have somebody in my organization do this. I'm going to have somebody outside of my
Right.
organization do this. That's going to increase my pace, potentially reduce my risk, and of course, make it easier to pivot when we need to change. So when we think about capacity, yes, we have our internal capacity, which is always restricted, but then we also have our external capacity, which can be exploited. And the great news is for supply chain, we know what the motivations, they're predictable. It's their motivation to sell you more stuff, right? So if we can work with them together to create something new and unique, and they're also sharing the load, that potentially is a better use of resources than necessarily trying to develop everything in-house, especially when we're limited by capacity. The other thing I'd add to this is how do we judge our forecasting around a concept that we're working on? In
Mm.
the early stages, it might be very difficult to understand what the magnitude and impact of something is, but our hunch is that it's interesting. And what I'm typically advising organizations to do is to independently forecast around a concept and not have the person that's actually working on it doing that. Maybe they contribute to it, but an independent network of people will look at a range of 20, 30, 50 concepts and make individual assessments on those because nothing's 100%. But that way, we take the biasing out of the process. If you're working on something, of course, you want it to be successful. but you might not have the expertise to judge whether this is $100 million opportunity or $1 billion opportunity. It just might not be your skill set. You might be an engineer, for example. Whereas if we can take that forecasting and separate it from that individual, so they define what they think it is, they define what they think the market is, they do that normal concept development stuff, but someone else makes the prediction on how likely is this going to happen, and they do it across all of the portfolio. That makes it much easier to then make judgments about where we should put our time and our energy without questioning the individual that's working on it and whether they've biased the process or whether they're just talking out of their hat.
It is easy for us to bias the process when we're well attached to it. We, as humans, we have a tendency to fall in love with the thing we're creating. And I always encourage my students, fall in love with the customer's problem, not
Right.
your solution. We've heard that from many places, but certainly important.
I have an
Yeah, go ahead.
addition I'd like to just make to that point because I think I've seen this so many times, and it was the same when I was a corporate innovator. You're working on something and you hit a roadblock, and you feel it as more of a sort of personal failure. It's like, oh, why can't I get over this hurdle? And so you typically ask the 5 people that you sit around, what do you think? What do you think? And you maybe get some inputs. Maybe they can help, maybe they can't. It's worth noting that everybody should be in that game. The entire organization should be there to help you. The
Right.
collective intelligence of your own organization might be able to get over that hurdle or of the wider network. And my experience now has shown that when we expose those problems and those roadblocks to a wider network of people, we'll either for sure know we can't do it, or we'll fix it much more quickly than we would have done if we were just trying to do it ourselves. And I think there's something about being humble, about knowing the fact that you're not expected to have all the answers. You're
Mm-hmm.
expected to take something through the process. Has a big value win in terms of accelerating our time to market, our time to innovation, and also failing a little faster. I have a client in the chemicals industry at the moment, and they've been struggling with a particular piece of chemistry for a couple of years. And I said, have you ever thought about asking your academic partners, these folks that you commission research with? We went out to 10 academic organizations. We found an expert in the field, and it was solved in 20 minutes. And they've been struggling with that for 2 years.
Right.
No money changed hands. This was just a friendly, oh, yeah, here's the research paper. There you go. That's how you do it. Right. But it's tempting when you're owning these things to really push it on. I just wanted to emphasize that because when we talk about resources, there's the person owning the concept, but then there's the wider network and ecosystem upon which you can
Mhm.
lean, which I think is underexploited.
Yeah, that's a very good point, right? We've had the open innovation phase many organizations have moved through that makes that more comfortable. I think there used to be a lot of not invented here kind of mentality. I'm sure we still find that in places. But I don't want to go on too big of a tangent. I think open innovation has really helped us to pull back the curtains on the use of external resources, been really helpful. But as you also said, it's our responsibility to follow the process. How do we innovate? And the organization should own that and then make good use of resources, internal and external. So I like that example about the chemistry. I want to ask you about the actual structure of portfolios a little bit. When I am doing work with an organization, I've seen many different kind of structures. Simple one to set up that works very well is we're going to have some of our work make what we have today a little bit better, right? Kind of that incremental development thing. We're going to have some of our work fix things that are just broken, doing sort of the maintenance thing. Some of our work is going to go into maybe the next big move forward. Maybe we call that the radical innovation sort of work. And then maybe we have some work on a platform that is going to tie together a lot of things we could do in the future. Or other ways, right? We might do it by business units. We might do it by product lines. We might put different labels on the things I just talked about. That's a portfolio for what we have in place today, per se, right? And kind of where we're going. I've seen innovation when we think about new concepts managed as a separate portfolio where we feel like we have a little bit more flexibility to kill off things or put things on shelves. And that usually doesn't happen in the other portfolio so much. And I've seen some attempts to try to integrate those. Can you just talk to us a little bit about the actual structure? How do we think about innovation in the existence of an existing portfolio inside an organization?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would typically separate out the incremental from everything else. This, just to be clear about our terms, I typically think about incremental as being improvements to things that we do already for clients that we already have or customers we already have.
Mm-hmm.
It's optimization and improvement on our existing portfolio. This is a portfolio where the knowns are much clearer. The predictions can be much more accurate, and usually the timeline to make those changes is much faster. But then, of course, we have adjacencies. We have potentially creating a new capability for a new customer, which is much more adventurous, perhaps more disruptive or radical innovation. And these things where the metrics are much less easy to quantify. The high levels of uncertainty are higher, and potentially the wins are also higher. So it's bigger bets. If you think about it in the casino example, you've got your small bets, which are your incremental improvements, and then you go all the way to your big bets, which is your more radical disruptive stuff, where potentially we could revolutionize an industry or can build an entire new market for ourselves. But of course, we're not sure. If it was sure, we were sure we would have done it already. So I think there is a benefit in separating those two out, but then thinking about it in terms of quantity of effort. So at the very top level of an organization, you ideally want one single view because all of its change and all of its new is just a level of magnitude and uncertainty. So at a very top level of an organization, I'd love a dashboard which says to me, this is how much capacity I'm putting into my incremental work. And this is the forecast return over time of that incremental work. And I can then compare that to the more strategic stuff that I'm doing and the more disruptive stuff that I'm doing. Now, a savvy executive should know that I need energy in all three of those zones. In the past, there was this conversation about a golden ratio, a percentage of effort that you would allocate to these three different buckets. I think that time has gone. And I don't remember exactly, but I think it was something like 70, 20, 10 or something like that was that golden ratio. I think that was more representative of what organizations did more so than what they should do. And the reason that I think that golden ratio is somewhat defunct as an idea now is that the pace of change is so much faster, and certain industries are much easier to disrupt than they were in the past. You may have an organization that works heavily related to the combustion engine. Well, combustion engines are in decline due to electrification. They know that in 10 to 15 years' time, that the existing core business will be decimated. That's a wider trend around sustainability and move towards electric cars. So if you're in that business, what do? Yeah. You might be world leaders in your field, but the disruption is forcing you to a path where you have to change. In the past, we've seen the usage of things like paper and pulp drop down from 40% to 40% of peak levels. If you're in the paper and pulp business, you didn't really have the option to just keep innovating the core.
Right.
You had to shift that energy to more those strategic and disruptive areas to survive and thrive. And so this weighting of that portfolio needs to be cognizant of the organizational circumstances. And that's where strategy and alignment and foresighting are so critical, because we won't be able to sit on our laurels forever. You see the life cycle of organizations getting shorter and shorter. And the reason for that is because it's getting easier and easier to disrupt organizations. And if you're big, especially, it's very difficult to turn the supertanker.
Right.
So that need for agility to be prepared to put more energy into those strategic and more disruptive spaces by accepting the fact that there is some risk there and that not everything we're going to work on is going to be successful is just going to have to be how it is. And the organizations that think that they can just continually incrementally improve and thrive are somewhat deluded, I think, now. I think we've seen enough of the trends to show that to be the case. Think about how many organizations went out of business due to COVID. Yeah. Think about what organizations did to thrive during COVID, who were able to pivot, and what were the fundamental reasons for that. It was about having that shelf that they could call upon something. It was about understanding the fact that energy needed to go into all of these three zones. And the answer for a law firm is going to be different to an aerospace firm. Yeah, the organization's weight of that energy is going to be different, but it needs to be considered as part of the whole. It's not for me to say an organization should be this weighting or that weighting, but it's about having an active conversation about what that weighting of energy should be.
Right.
But what I think I'm seeing now is increasingly executives recognizing the fact that we have to have some energy into the more strategic, disruptive spaces, because you just never know.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I think in the past, we've seen many organizations where perhaps nearly 100% of their efforts are going into the incremental area. We know what we do today. We're going to make that a little bit better as time goes along. But as we both know, I liked how you said earlier that innovation is the future sales of the organization. If we're not putting any energy into recognizing how our market is changing, how the business environment is changing, how technology trends like artificial intelligence is clearly the big one right now, is impacting the future of our work and our customers, we're not going to be prepared for those future sales, and we'll see our core diminish along the way. So perhaps separating that incremental focus from other innovation efforts is a good way to put that together. Appreciate you introducing that. As listeners know, we love innovation quotes, and I want to ask you to share one with us in just a moment. First, I just want to remind everyone that this area of portfolio management is one of the 7 elements of what I call product mastery. And this all began a long time ago through an organization, a nonprofit association called PDMA, Product Development Management Association. And I got involved with them more than 2 decades ago. And they had this little certification thing. And I was curious, what is it you learn in the certification? And I found it so very helpful. I started helping other people learn the same knowledge. And indeed, these are the 7 elements for product mastery. And we went from the beginning days of just having a collection of articles and books we pointed people to now having the actual book you can buy from Wiley, which I just held up if you're not on video. And at the 3rd edition now that I had the pleasure of co-authoring. And I've just created a training system to help you learn those 7 elements instead of going through you can go through the 400 pages of the book, certainly, but the training system will really help you learn them and put them into action. They're going to build your foundation. What I find so fascinating is most of the people that do this, they've already been product innovators, product managers for a few years. Colin, I recently had this great conversation with someone I had done some work with in the past, John Sparrow, and we were talking about this, and he brought up, I said, well, I was in R&D for, like 17 years, I think he said. I thought I knew this stuff really well. And when I got introduced to these 7 elements, I found out where my holes were and where I could actually dive in a lot deeper and bring these things together. So if you are someone who's committed to this profession of product innovation and want to rise up in the ranks and help others as well, lead others, this is a really good system for you. Simply called the Rapid Product Mastery Experience. Go to our website, productmasterynow.com, and you'll find information on the training system for Rapid Product Mastery. So back to the quote. Colin, what did you put together for us, and tell us what that means?
So it's a leader on what we just discussed a little earlier, which is where's your innovation shelf? And do you have a home for the things that you'd like to do when the opportunity arises? And the reason that this is my favorite quote, and unfortunately I am quoting myself, is because I asked this question to a conference audience in Germany, in Berlin, some years ago. And in the audience was a gentleman from Airbus, a client that I'd had for several years. And he came marching up to me and said, Colin, I learned something new today. And I said, okay, what's that? He said, where's my innovation shelf? I don't have an innovation shelf. I don't have a home for the things that we stopped, for the things that we'd like to do, for the stuff that was kind of just put to one side whilst other things took priority. There's a massive knowledge repository that we just simply are not exploiting. And this is now crucial. And actually, an Airbus, what they ended up doing was actually creating a commercial arm to sell unutilized IP. So things that were sat on the innovation shelf that they had created but weren't utilizing in any way, they would actually then license it out or sell it on. And the innovation shelf can be a commercial driver as well. So I think it's a very simple thing for organizations to do, and relatively few actually have that idea of an innovation shelf or a home for unloved toys, let's say. So that's why it's my favorite quote in innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a role that a senior innovation director in an organization can play, help the organization with. I really see that person and maybe a small team helping just connect, right? Who are the people that are in the organization that have knowledge, and what are the things that we've tried before and maybe sat on the shelf that we can dust off and bring out for something. So I like the quote. Thank you very much. And nothing wrong with sharing your own quote. All the better to have your own. How can people find out more about the work that you do and Hype Innovation?
So I'm pretty much a LinkedIn guy. That's typically where you'll find most of my content. So in terms of Hype Innovation, you can just type that in .com. You'll find the website. Follow Hype Innovation on LinkedIn. You also see a great amount of content. In terms of me, I'm Colin Nelson on LinkedIn. You'll find me pretty easily, but Colin Nelson Innovation, you won't struggle to find me. I also occasionally host the Innovation Room podcast, which you can find leisure. But we generate content pretty regularly. I'm typically blogging at least every week, and I run a webinar on different slices of innovation management every month. So look out for those. Yeah, you're very welcome. One final appeal, if you're interested, we have an automated innovation management assessment that's on the
Mhm.
Hype Innovation website. So if you want to understand how your organization matches up with the ISO standard for innovation management, ISO 56000, there's a little questionnaire you can go through to just give you a sense of where you're up to. And I get those, and I sort of add a little bit of flavor to those. And that's a free service that we offer for organizations that want to get a sense of how they're doing.
Fantastic. Glad to know about the assessment as well. And that's all off the Hype Innovation website.
Yeah, maybe we can put it in the show notes or something.
Yeah, I will provide a link to the assessment, so it will be in there for everyone. Colin, thanks so much for joining us, helping us to think about innovation management and portfolio management.
You're very welcome. Good to speak to you, Chad.
And everyone else, if you want to find the written version of everything we just discussed, simply go to productmasterynow.com/541. Also, if you want to check out our YouTube channel, that's at Product Mastery Now on YouTube. It needs some love. We're still figuring that out. So if you could subscribe, that would certainly be helpful there as well. As always, keep innovating.
Thank you for listening to Product Mastery Now, where product leaders and managers gain product mastery through practical knowledge, influence, and confidence. By listening, you are becoming a product master, creating products customers love. Find additional resources at productmasterynow.com. Keep innovating.